What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their sensitivity is not weakness. It's a highly tuned perceptual system. They don't just hear your words. They register tone, intent, inconsistency, and emotional subtext all at once. So when you consistently invalidate an empath's feelings, you're not simply disagreeing with them, you're disrupting the very mechanism they use to connect, trust, and feel safe in a relationship. At first, an empath will try to bridge that gap. They'll explain themselves more clearly, soften their delivery, and even question whether they're overreacting. This is important because it shows that they are not impulsive in their withdrawal. They attempt repair. They seek alignment. But when their internal reality is repeatedly dismissed, when they're told they're too sensitive, too emotional, or that what they feel isn't real, they begin to experience a form of cognitive dissonance. Their perception says one thing, but the person they care about insists on another. And here's where the shift begins. An empath will tolerate misunderstanding, but they will not tolerate being consistently misrepresented. Over time, repeated invalidation forces them into a psychological dilemma. Either they betray their own perception to maintain the relationship, or they honor their perception and risk losing the connection. For a while, they may choose the first option, they may silence themselves, they may shrink. But that comes at a cost: the erosion of self-trust. Once self-trust begins to erode, the empath becomes hyper-aware of it. They start noticing how often they second-guess their instincts around you, how often they leave conversations feeling confused instead of understood. And that awareness is critical because it marks the beginning of detachment, not emotional detachment from you, but a recalibration back toward themselves. At this stage, they don't announce what's happening. There's no dramatic confrontation. Instead, they observe. They listen more than they speak. They test whether the pattern changes, and when it does, they arrive at a quiet but definitive conclusion. This environment is not emotionally safe. And once an empath labels a space as unsafe, their behavior changes in a way that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. They stop investing emotionally, they stop seeking validation, they stop explaining themselves. From the outside, it may look like they're becoming distant or indifferent. But internally, what's actually happening is much more precise. They're withdrawing access. Because for an empath, connection is not automatic, it's granted. And when that connection is repeatedly met with dismissal, they don't fight harder for it. They remove it. So by the time they finally leave, it feels sudden to the other person. But for the empath, it's the end of a long internal process, one where they've already grieved the relationship, already accepted the reality, and already chosen themselves. And that's the part most people miss. An empath doesn't disappear because they're fragile. They disappear because they've learned that being misunderstood repeatedly is a form of emotional isolation. And they would rather be alone than feel alone with someone else. If you look closely at how an empath operates in a relationship, you'll notice something that most people initially mistake for unconditional generosity. They give consistently, attentively, and often without being asked. But this isn't random kindness. It's driven by a heightened awareness of emotional needs. They sense shifts in your mood, they anticipate discomfort, and they move toward it with the intention of restoring balance. Now that becomes powerful in the right environment. But in the wrong environment, it becomes a liability. Because when someone learns, consciously or unconsciously, that the empath will keep giving regardless of what they receive in return, a subtle imbalance begins to form. At first, it's almost invisible. The empath gives a little more. The other person gives a little less. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth confronting. But over time, that asymmetry compounds. And here's where the psychology becomes important. Empaths don't measure relationships transactionally in the beginning. They're not keeping score. They're focused on connection, not calculation. So they'll continue to invest time, energy, emotional labor, long past the point where a more self-protective individual would have already pulled back. But the body keeps track, even when the mind tries not to. Eventually, the empath begins to feel a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from effort alone, but from imbalance. It's the fatigue of constantly pouring into something that doesn't replenish. And at first, they won't blame the other person. They'll internalize it. They'll think, maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe this is just how relationships are. Maybe I need to be more understanding. But that narrative has a limit, because over time, patterns become undeniable. They start noticing that they're the one initiating every meaningful conversation. They're the one providing support during difficult moments. They're the one adjusting, accommodating, and maintaining the emotional structure of the relationship. And the realization that follows is not loud, it's precise. This is not mutual. And once an empath sees that clearly, their behavior begins to shift. But not in the way most people expect. They don't immediately confront or demand change. Instead, they reduce investment, not as a strategy, but as a natural response to depletion. They start conserving energy. They stop overextending. They observe what happens when they give less. What usually happens is revealing. The relationship doesn't stabilize. It weakens. Communication drops. Effort from the other side doesn't increase. And that confirms something the empath was beginning to suspect. The connection was being sustained almost entirely by them. At that point, the decision is no longer emotional, it's structural. They recognize that continuing in this dynamic would require ongoing self-abandonment. And that's a cost they're no longer willing to pay. So they withdraw. Not dramatically, not vindictively, but definitively. They stop offering what was never truly valued. They step back from a dynamic that only worked when they were over-functioning within it. And from the outside, it can seem confusing. They were so giving, so present. What changed? But nothing changed suddenly. What you're seeing is the result of accumulated imbalance reaching its threshold. Because here's the reality. An empath will give without keeping score, but they will not give indefinitely without reciprocity. And the moment they realize they are being drained instead of appreciated, they don't try to fix the dynamic anymore. They exit it, and if there's one thing to understand, it's this. When someone stops pouring into you, it's not always because they have less to give. It's because they've finally recognized where their energy is no longer being respected. There's a common assumption that empaths rely primarily on what is said to them. In reality, they rely far more on what is felt. Words matter, but alignment matters more. And when there's a gap between the two, when someone says one thing but behaves in a way that suggests something else, that gap doesn't go unnoticed. It becomes the focal point of the entire interaction. An empath is constantly running a kind of internal calibrati on. They're comparing verbal statements with tone, timing, body language, and behavioral consistency. When those elements align, trust forms naturally. There's no effort required. But when they don't align, when there are mixed signals, inconsistencies, or outright dishonesty, it creates a subtle but persistent tension. At first, the empath doesn't jump to conclusions. They assume complexity, not malice. They consider context. They give space for clarification. This is where many people misinterpret their patience as naivety. It's not that they don't see the inconsistency. It's that they're allowing room for it to resolve. But when it doesn't resolve, when the pattern repeats, something shifts. Because inconsistency forces the empath into a state of ongoing interpretation. They're no longer experiencing the relationship directly. They're analyzing it, trying to decode what's real, what's performative, what's stable, and what's subject to change. And that cognitive load is not sustainable. What's important to understand is that trust for an empath is not built on promises. It's built on predictability. Not rigid predictability, but enough consistency that they can orient themselves without having to question everything. When someone is warm one day and distant the next, open in one moment and evasive in another, it disrupts that orientation. And over time, that disruption erodes trust more effectively than a single clear betrayal ever could. Because a clear betrayal can be confronted, it can be defined, but mixed signals create ambiguity, and ambiguity keeps the empath engaged far longer than clarity would. They stay not because they're convinced, but because they're trying to resolve the contradiction. Eventually, though, even that process reaches a limit. There comes a point where the empath recognizes that the confusion is not incidental, it's structural. That he inconsistency isn't something to be solved, but something to be accepted as part of the dynamic. And once they reach that conclusion, the entire framework changes. They stop asking questions, not because they have answers, but because they've realized the answers won't bring stability. They stop seeking reassurance because reassurance without consistency has no value. And most importantly, they stop investing trust. Now, from the outside, this can look like detachment, but internally, it's a very deliberate shift. They are no longer trying to make sense of the other person. They are prioritizing their own clarity. And clarity in this context leads to a simple decision. If the connection requires constant interpretation to maintain, it's not a stable connection. So they step away. Not out of anger, but out of resolution. They choose an environment where what is said and what is done are in alignment, even if that environment is solitude. Because for an empath, confusion is not just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. And they will tolerate many things, but they will not stay indefinitely in a space where truth feels inconsistent. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't lose an empath when you make a mistake. You lose them when your words and actions stop matching, and they realize they can no longer trust what they're experiencing. If you trace everything we've talked about, emotional invalidation, imbalance, inconsistency, they all converge on a single underlying variable. Emotional safety, not comfort, not agreement, but safety. The ability to exist in a space where your internal experience isn't under threat. For an empath, this isn't optional, it's foundational. And here's where people often miscalculate. They assume an empath will stay because they're compassionate, because they understand, because they can see the pain behind someone's behavior. And all of that is true, but it doesn't override the need for safety. In fact, the more aware an empath is of someone else's instability, the more carefully they begin to assess whether that instability is something they can coexist with. At first, they adapt. They regulate themselves to maintain the connection. They become more patient, more accommodating, more precise in how they communicate. This is not submission, it's calibration. They're trying to find a version of the dynamic that works without sacrificing the relationship. But adaptation has a threshold. When the environment becomes unpredictable, when reactions are disproportionate, when communication turns volatile, when emotional responses feel inconsistent or even punitive, the empath's nervous system starts to register that as risk. Not theoretical risk, but lived, repeated exposure to something that doesn't feel stable. And the critical shift here is not emotional, it's biological. Because once the body starts associating a person with stress, confusion, or emotional instability, the empath can no longer fully relax into the connection. They may still show up. They may still engage, but internally, they are no longer at ease. They're monitoring, filtering, managing. That's not connection. That's survival. And no one can sustain a relationship in a state of continuous self-regulation without eventually burning out. So the empath begins to do something very subtle but very significant. They start prioritizing their internal state over the external relationship, not in a selfish way, but in a stabilizing way. They begin asking a different question, not how do I make this work, but what is this doing to me? Because once they honestly assess the cost mentally, emotionally, even physically, they realize that staying requires them to continuously override their own sense of safety. And that's the one line they will not cross indefinitely. So when they leave, it doesn't come from impulse. It comes from accumulated data. Repeated experiences that have led them to a clear conclusion: this environment is not sustainable for who I am. And when that conclusion solidifies, their exit is not partial. They don't leave one foot in and one foot out. They withdraw completely, communication drops, access closes, not to punish, not to provoke a reaction, but to restore equilibrium. From the outside, it can feel abrupt, even cold, but internally, it's the most aligned decision they can make. Because for the first time in a long time, they are no longer negotiating with their own well-being. And that's the part that often goes unrecognized. An empath doesn't disappear because they stopped caring. They disappear because they started caring about themselves enough to stop tolerating what was quietly breaking them. So if there's one idea worth holding on to, it's this: emotional safety is not something you can demand after it's been compromised. It's something you have to consistently create, or eventually you will find yourself alone, wondering when the connection disappeared.